When I walk up there, will you come with me? Daniel Wright was about to head toward the stage when the voice stopped him. He turned and saw a young woman standing close to the wall, both hands holding an invitation card against her chest. The edges of the card had already begun to curl from being gripped for too long. The moment Annie met his eyes, she immediately looked down. "I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't have come up and asked you something like that." She tried to smooth the invitation with her palm, but the more she did, the more obvious the trembling in her fingers became. "If you're busy, please go ahead. I just thought maybe I should try asking once." Daniel did not leave. He looked at her more closely. Her navy blazer had been carefully pressed, though the fabric near the cuffs was worn. Her white blouse was clean, the collar neatly arranged. Her black shoes were old, but polished so thoroughly that the overhead lights reflected off their toes. Annie had done everything she could with what she had to make herself look as though she belonged on a day like this. Only her eyes betrayed how uneasy she felt. Daniel lowered his voice. "You want me to walk onto the stage with you?" Annie looked up, then quickly dropped her eyes back to the invitation. "If it wouldn't be too much trouble, sir, I don't need you to do very much. Just walk beside me for a little while. And if you could, maybe stand next to me when they take the picture." A burst of applause came from the auditorium. Annie flinched slightly and looked through the opening in the curtain. A student who had just received her scholarship was standing between her parents. Her mother adjusted her daughter's collar while her father held up his phone and took picture after picture. All three laughed when the photographer asked them to move closer together. Annie immediately looked away. Daniel noticed. "Where's your family?" She went still. The thumb that had been rubbing the corner of the invitation stopped. "I don't have anyone coming today, sir." Daniel remained silent. Annie tried to keep her expression composed, but her next breath came shorter than the one before. "My father died when I was little. Then my mother passed away too." She swallowed and pressed her lips together before continuing. "My grandmother raised me. She died 2 years ago." Her head lowered a little farther. "So now it's just me, sir." A volunteer carrying a stack of folders walked past them. The woman heard the last sentence and slowed for a moment before continuing toward the stage. Annie noticed the look. She immediately straightened her shoulders, almost as though she needed to prove that she was all right. "I can take care of myself, sir. I always have." Daniel did not answer. He looked down at the invitation. Annie Johnson, Wright Future Scholars Award. The name was familiar. He had read it in the scholarship files. Outstanding grades, debate team, exceptionally strong recommendations. One of the most impressive applications in the entire program. But nowhere in that file had it said that today she would be standing behind this curtain alone. 3 students approached from the hallway. Paige noticed Annie first. "Annie, you still haven't gone up?" "It isn't my turn yet." Paige glanced toward the main entrance. "You still haven't found anyone to go up with you?" Annie's cheeks immediately grew warm. "I'm fine." Trevor, standing beside Paige, adjusted the cuff of his jacket and glanced at Annie. "Seriously? Nobody?" Paige turned toward him. "Trevor, I'm just asking." The third student looked through the curtain toward the families posing for photographs. "That's probably going to be a little awkward when they take the picture." Annie lowered her eyes. Trevor let out a short laugh. "If it were me, I wouldn't want to walk up there alone either." Paige frowned. "Knock it off." They continued down the hallway. Annie remained still until the sound of their footsteps faded. Then she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, even though it had never been out of place. "They weren't trying to make me feel bad, sir." Daniel looked at her. "You don't have to make excuses for them." Annie pressed her lips together and tried to smile. "I'm used to people asking questions." An announcement came from the stage. "Recipients in the next group, please prepare." Annie immediately turned her head. She pulled the invitation closer to her chest, as though it might somehow steady her heartbeat. Daniel looked at her. "Are you afraid to go on stage?" Annie shook her head. "It's not the stage, sir." "Then what is it?" She looked through the opening in the curtain again. A young man stood between his mother and father beneath the scholarship banner. His mother had an arm around his shoulders. His father patted him on the back just before the camera flashed. Annie turned away. "I can walk up there by myself. I can take the certificate. I don't need anyone to hold my hand." Daniel waited. Her voice grew quieter. "It's just, when everyone looks at what?" She touched her printed name on the invitation with the tip of one fingernail. "At who has someone standing beside them." Daniel said nothing. Annie continued, more carefully this time. People have talked about me all year, about my clothes, about me taking the bus, about the neighborhood where I live. Some of them called me the scholarship girl before I even knew whether I would get one. A faint laugh escaped her, but it disappeared almost immediately. And today everyone has someone with them. Some of their mothers brought flowers. Some of them have their whole families sitting out there. I'm not jealous of them, sir. She said it quickly, almost afraid Daniel might misunderstand. I really am happy for them. Then what makes you sad? Annie looked at him. A thin sheen of tears had formed over her eyes. Because I don't want a day that's supposed to be happy to become the day I remember most, because I had to stand there alone. Daniel kept his eyes on her. Annie drew a quiet breath. I thought maybe I could just walk up quickly, take the certificate, and come back down. But they take a picture of every recipient. Everyone's family comes up afterward. She pressed the invitation against her stomach. I'm afraid that when it's my turn, they'll ask the parents to come up, and no one will stand. Daniel's brow tightened slightly. Annie immediately added, I know that isn't anyone's fault, and I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. She stepped back half a pace. I just thought that if there were one person standing beside me, maybe it wouldn't feel quite so bad. Daniel asked, Is that why you came to me? Annie gave a small nod. Yes, sir. You know I still have to speak at the podium? I know, sir. Annie nodded again quickly. I saw the program schedule. I know you're the sponsor, and everyone is waiting for you. I wouldn't keep you long. She raised 2 fingers, as if trying to show him how little time she meant. Just a few minutes, sir. I can walk most of the way myself. You would only have to come out with me when they call my name and stand beside me for the picture. Then you can go right back to what you need to do. Daniel remained silent. The longer the silence lasted, the more unsettled Annie became. She hurried to add, You wouldn't have to tell anyone who I am. You wouldn't have to pretend you know me. If anyone asks, I can tell them, I only asked you to stand with me. Daniel watched her. Have you asked anyone else? Annie hesitated. Yes, sir, I have. How many people? Slowly, she raised 2 fingers. Tfo. They both said no? Annie nodded. One woman said she needed to sit with her own family. The other told me I should be confident and walk up by myself. She tried to smile. Maybe they're right. But you still came to ask me. The smile disappeared. Because it's almost my turn. The simple answer seemed to quiet the space between them. Annie looked toward the curtain. I don't have much time left to pretend this doesn't hurt anymore. Daniel said nothing. Annie pulled her sleeves farther down until they covered most of her fingers. I know you don't owe me anything. And I know I'm asking someone I don't even know to do something very personal. She lifted her eyes to him. But I don't have anyone else left to ask, sir. Applause rose again from the stage. Another name had just been announced. Annie looked through the curtain, then quickly turned back. I won't bother you afterward. I promise. Daniel studied her for a long moment. You keep saying you won't bother me. Annie looked uncertain. Because I'm afraid you'll think I'm taking advantage of your kindness. You're asking me to stand beside you in a photograph. Yes, sir. That's all? Annie nodded, but then her eyes dropped again. Actually, she stopped. Daniel waited. Annie gently pinched the edge of the invitation. If it's all right, when they call my name, could you walk with me from here, sir? Her voice became even softer. I don't want to go through that curtain alone. Daniel looked at her. Annie immediately rushed to explain. You don't have to hold my hand. I just want to know that when I walk out there, I won't be the only person who doesn't have anyone beside her. A group of parents behind them laughed at something. Annie's shoulders drew in slightly. Then a voice drifted down the hallway. Is that the girl whose family didn't come? Another voice answered more quietly. That's so sad. Annie heard them. This time she did not turn around. She only lowered her head and pressed her thumb hard against the edge of the invitation until the white paper bent into another crease. Daniel saw her lower lip tremble. Are you all right? It took Annie several seconds to answer. Yes, sir. But the words were so quiet that she hardly seemed to believe them herself. She drew a slow breath and said, I just don't want people feeling sorry for me on a day I worked so hard to earn. Daniel tightened his grip slightly on the papers in his hand. Annie looked up at him, her eyes red, but her voice still careful and respectful. I don't need you to pretend you're my father, and I don't want you to tell anyone that I'm someone they should feel sorry for. She paused. I just want someone standing beside me. Behind the curtain, the announcer began introducing the next group of scholarship recipients. Annie startled. The invitation visibly trembled in her hand. She looked at Daniel. "Sir, if you don't want to, I understand." As soon as she said it, Annie turned her eyes toward the stage as though preparing herself to walk out alone. But then she stopped. One last time, she looked back at him. This time, she did not apologize. "Please," she said. "When they call my name, just stand beside me, sir." Daniel looked at her for a long moment as, on the other side of the curtain, the first name in Annie's group was announced, and Annie stood there, waiting for his answer. Daniel's expression changed, but not in the way Annie feared. He did not check his watch or glance toward the podium, where people were waiting for him. Instead, he lowered his eyes, neatly folded the speech in his hand, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. When he looked up again, he turned fully toward Annie, as though in that moment, nothing beyond the curtain mattered more than the young woman struggling to keep tears from spilling from her eyes. "Let me make sure I understand. When they call your name, you want me to walk out with you and stand beside you for the photograph?" Annie nodded. She quickly brushed the back of her hand beneath the corner of one eye, then lowered it at once, as though afraid he might notice. "Yes, sir, just for a little while. I won't keep you long. Once they take the picture, you can go straight back to the podium. I know everyone is waiting for you." Daniel studied her for a few seconds. "What makes you think standing beside you right now isn't exactly where I'm supposed to be?" Annie looked up. She seemed unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "You mean?" Daniel did not answer with words. He simply offered her his arm. Annie looked at his arm, then at him. The eyes she had been trying so hard to keep composed immediately reddened. You really will come with me, sir? If I didn't mean it, I wouldn't be standing here offering you my arm." Annie's lips parted, but no sound came out. She quickly lowered her head and drew a breath to contain the emotion rising inside her before finally resting her fingertips against his sleeve. Her touch was so light that she was barely touching the fabric. Daniel glanced down. "You can hold on to me. I'm not going anywhere." Annie tightened her grip slightly, then loosened it again. "I'm afraid I'll wrinkle your jacket, sir." A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. "I think the suit can survive that." Annie laughed through her tears. She turned her face slightly away, quickly wiped the corner of her eye, then held his arm a little more firmly. A coordinator carrying a clipboard hurried toward them. "Mr. Wright, they're waiting for you on the other side of the stage. You need to join the presentation line from stage right." Daniel looked at her. "I'll enter from this side." The coordinator blinked. "Sir, the sequence has already been arranged. If you enter from here, we'll have to change the positioning for the presentation. Then change it." Her eyes briefly dropped to Annie's hand resting on Daniel's arm before returning to him. Daniel offered no explanation. After a moment of hesitation, the coordinator nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll notify the stage team." As soon as she walked away, Annie leaned slightly toward Daniel, her voice dropping. "Sir, I don't want everyone to have to change the whole program because of me. If it's too much trouble, I can go by myself. I really can." Daniel watched the coordinator leave, then turned back to Annie. "Annie, I changed where I'm standing. I didn't rewrite the Constitution." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Annie immediately covered her mouth, embarrassed even as she laughed. "I'm sorry." Apologizing again, she lowered her eyes, but this time the smile remained. "I'm trying to break that habit, sir. Today is a good day to start." Another scholarship recipient's name echoed through the auditorium. Annie immediately looked toward the curtain. Her smile faded slightly, and the hand resting on Daniel's arm tightened without her realizing it. "Have felt it. You remember what you're supposed to do when we walk out there?" Annie nodded quickly. "I walk to the center of the stage, shake the dean's hand, take the certificate, and then stand on the mark they put on the floor for the picture." "Very good. I've watched everyone before me do it a lot." "I noticed." Annie glanced at him. "I'm afraid I'll do something wrong." "Then we already have a plan. You do exactly what you just told me. And if something goes wrong, we'll stand in the wrong place together." Annie looked at him for another second before a small smile appeared. "You make this sound like we're preparing for a business meeting. Trust me, most business meetings aren't nearly as well prepared as you are." This time Annie laughed more freely, but before the sound had faded, familiar voices came from behind them. Paige, Trevor, and another student were heading toward the waiting area. All three slowed when they saw Annie holding Daniel's arm. Trevor stopped altogether. "Wait, you actually got Mr. Wright to go with you?" Annie's smile disappeared. Her fingers immediately curled tighter around Daniel's sleeve. She shifted slightly toward him, as though trying to shrink away from their attention. Paige turned toward Trevor. "Don't start." "I didn't say anything. But I know that look." Trevor lowered his voice, though not enough to keep Annie from hearing. "I just didn't think she'd actually go ask him." Annie lowered her eyes. One foot slipped half a step backward. Daniel remained still. He only turned his head toward Trevor. "Is there something you need from me?" Trevor immediately straightened. "No, sir." "Then I think your time would be better spent preparing for your own scholarship presentation." Daniel's voice was not harsh, but it was enough to make Trevor stop looking at Annie. "Yes, sir." Paige looked at Annie. "You okay?" Annie needed a moment before nodding. "I'm okay." This time, her voice did not break the way it had before. Paige smiled, discreetly gave her a thumbs up, then followed the other two down the hallway. Annie watched them disappear. After a few seconds, she drew her lips inward. "I wish they hadn't seen." Daniel asked. "Seen what?" "That I had to ask you to stand with me." Annie's voice grew quieter. "Now they'll think I'm weak. Or that I needed someone important to come rescue me before I could even walk onto the stage." Daniel leaned slightly so he could see her face more clearly. "Did you ask me to earn this scholarship for you?" Annie shook her head. "No, sir." "Did you ask me to attend your classes for you?" "No." "Take your exams?" "No, sir." "Write your application, your essays, or earn the grades that got your name called today?" Annie fell silent before shaking her head again. "No, sir." Daniel gave a small nod. "Then I'm not rescuing you." Annie looked through the opening in the curtain. "Then what are you doing, sir?" "Walking a few steps with you." She turned back toward him. Daniel continued, "Don't give people who have seen only a few minutes of your life the power to decide what those few minutes mean." Annie remained silent for a long moment. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't." "Then how can you say it so calmly?" "Because you're already worried enough for both of us." The corner of Annie's mouth lifted slightly. Another name was announced. 4 more before hers. A staff member shifted the curtain aside, opening a gap wide enough for Annie to see the stage. The podium stood beneath bright white lights. The Right Future Scholars logo filled the screen behind it. Another family had just moved into position for a photograph, and phones rose all at once from the audience. Annie immediately released Daniel's arm. He looked down at his now empty sleeve. "Changed your mind?" "No, sir." Annie quickly rubbed her palm against the side of her blazer. "My hand is all sweaty. I'm afraid I'll stain your jacket." "Annie." "Yes, sir." "That's perspiration, not house paint." She laughed. "But your jacket must be expensive." "It's still just a jacket. If I ruined it, I'd probably have to work at the bakery for a very long time to pay you back. I've had worse things happen to a suit." Annie looked at him curiously. "Really, sir?" "Someone once spilled an entire cup of coffee on me about 10 minutes before a television interview." Her eyes widened. "Oh, you must have been furious." "I was more upset about losing the coffee." Annie laughed out loud. "What kind of coffee was worth being that upset over?" "Black." She wrinkled her nose. "Sir, if I may be honest, that sounds more like punishment than a drink." Daniel looked at her as though personally offended. "I've been drinking it that way for 30 years. Doing something for 30 years doesn't make it taste better, sir. You're getting awfully bold with the man who just agreed to walk with you." Annie tried to suppress a smile. "I still have time to change my mind, sir." "That's better." Annie suddenly realized she had been joking. For a few brief seconds, she had forgotten to look toward the auditorium. Then another name was announced. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. Only 2 remained. Annie looked down at the invitation. Her thumb once again passed over the letters of her printed name. Daniel watched her for a moment. "What does the card say?" Annie looked at him, confused. "My name, sir." "Read all of it." "Sir?" "Read it to me." She looked down. "Annie Johnson, recipient of the Right Future Scholars Award. Does it say anywhere where you bought your blazer?" Annie shook her head. "No, sir." "Does it mention that you take the bus?" "No." "Does it say what neighborhood you live in?" "No, sir." "Does it say how many family members came with you today?" Annie looked up. Her eyes were wet again. "No." Daniel lightly touched the edge of the invitation with one finger. "Then don't let the things that aren't written there become bigger than the thing that is." Annie looked at her name again. This time, she did not rub at the bend in the card. The next name was announced. Only one person remained before her. The coordinator returned, holding the clipboard against her chest. "Miss Johnson, get ready. You're next." The color drained slightly from Annie's face. She swallowed, looked toward the stage, then immediately searched for Daniel with her eyes. He did not wait for her to ask. Daniel offered his arm. This time Annie took it at once. Her fingertips were ice cold. "Mr. Wright, I'm right here." Annie's voice trembled. "What if I trip in front of everyone, sir? I'll tell them it was part of the program." A trembling smile appeared beneath her tear-bright eyes. "And what if I forget where I'm supposed to stand? I'll stand in the wrong place with you. You're not very good at calming people down in the usual way." "I don't remember promising to do it the usual way." Annie gave a soft laugh. The applause for the previous recipient began to fade. The coordinator lifted one hand, signaling for them to move forward. Annie took one step, then another. Stage light spilled through the opening in the curtain and washed over the old blazer she had prepared so carefully. By instinct, Annie reached down to straighten the front of it. Daniel spoke softly. "Don't adjust it anymore." Her hand stopped halfway. She looked at him. Daniel met her tear-filled eyes. "You don't need to fix one more thing about yourself to deserve to walk out there." Annie bit lightly at her lower lip. "But I'm afraid people will see that I'm not like them. They should see you." One last tear slipped from the corner of Annie's eye. She quickly wiped it away. Daniel spoke slowly. "You came here exactly as you are. That's enough. If Annie's courage touched your heart, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories." She looked at him. "Annie Johnson." The announcer's voice carried across the auditorium, followed by the first wave of applause. Annie did not move. For half a second, her body seemed to forget everything they had just discussed. The invitation card pressed against her palm, Daniel's arm beneath her other hand, the open curtain a few feet away. Beyond it waited the stage, the lights, the scholarship committee, and hundreds of faces. Daniel did not pull her forward. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Annie swallowed. "They already called me. They can wait 2 seconds." A second round of applause began, louder this time, partly because the audience expected someone to appear. Annie looked toward Daniel. "You're really coming? I'm still standing here, aren't I?" That was enough. She stepped through the curtain. Daniel went with her. The brightness from the stage reached them first. Annie blinked once as the auditorium opened in front of her. Rows of people filled the seats from the front aisle to the rear doors. Several families were still holding phones above shoulder height. At the center of the stage stood the dean beside a table lined with scholarship certificates. Annie's pace slowed. Daniel adjusted his own steps without making it obvious. She held his arm more firmly now. The applause changed when people recognized him. A murmur moved through the audience. Daniel Wright was supposed to be near the podium with the scholarship committee, not walking beside one of the recipients. A photographer lifted his camera immediately. Annie heard whispers from somewhere near the front. "Is that Mr. Wright? Why is he walking with her?" "I think she came alone." Her jaw tightened. Daniel noticed. "Eyes ahead," he said quietly. "I heard them." "So did I." Annie looked at him. And your certificate is still waiting." The corner of her mouth moved. They reached the first step. Annie paused before placing one foot on it. Daniel had seen people cross stages before with confidence that came from years of being told they deserved the space they occupied. Annie moved differently. She checked every step as if she feared making one mistake that would confirm every cruel assumption she had ever heard. Daniel leaned slightly toward her. "One at a time. I know how stairs work." "Good. We're already ahead of schedule." That made her breathe out a small laugh. She climbed. The second step came easier, then the third. By the time Annie reached the stage floor, her shoulders had lifted, and her hand no longer trembled as much against Daniel's sleeve. The dean approached with a broad smile. "Annie Johnson, congratulations." "Thank you, sir." He extended his hand. Annie released Daniel's arm long enough to shake it. The certificate was presented in a navy folder stamped with the foundation seal. Annie took it carefully with both hands. For a moment, she forgot the audience. Her eyes moved across her name. The dean said something about academic excellence and determination, but Annie barely heard him. She had filled out the application at a public library table after work. She had revised the essay 3 times because she could not afford to believe good enough would be enough. She had checked the scholarship portal from an old laptop whose battery lasted 20 minutes. Now the certificate was in her hands. No one had handed her the grades behind it. No one had written those essays for her. Daniel watched the realization settle across her face. The photographer motioned toward the marked position at center stage. Miss Johnson, Mr. Wright, right over here, please. Annie turned toward Daniel. You don't have to be in the picture if you don't want to. Daniel gave her a look. We've come this far. She almost smiled. They moved into position. The photographer raised his camera. Closer together, please. Annie shifted perhaps half an inch. Daniel noticed and extended his arm slightly, leaving the decision to her. She understood. After a brief hesitation, she rested her hand against it again. The photographer took the first image, then another. Something began happening in the audience. A woman near the center section stood first. She appeared to be in her 60s, wearing a red jacket and holding a program against her chest. She clapped above the general applause, slowly and deliberately. A man beside her rose too, then another person. Within several seconds, more people were standing. Annie noticed. Her expression tightened at first. Why are they standing? Daniel looked toward the audience. I think they're applauding you. They applauded everyone. Not like this. The sound built across the auditorium. It did not arrive all at once. It moved row by row until the scattered applause became something fuller. Parents who did not know Annie were standing. Faculty members joined them. Several scholarship recipients waiting near the curtain began clapping as well. Paige was among them. Even Trevor stood farther back, his earlier smirk gone. Annie's eyes filled. She lowered her face. Daniel spoke near enough that only she could hear. Don't hide now. I'm trying not to cry. Those are different things. She gave a shaky laugh and looked up again. The announcer approached the microphone. Annie, before you leave the stage, would you like to say a few words? Her expression changed immediately. No. The microphone picked up the answer. A few people laughed warmly. Annie looked horrified. Daniel covered a smile. The announcer laughed too. That was very clear. Annie whispered to Daniel. I didn't know the microphone was on. I gathered that. Please don't laugh. I'm making no promises. Her embarrassment lasted only a moment before the announcer lowered the microphone and asked more softly. You don't have to. But if there's anything you'd like to say, this is your moment. Annie looked at the audience. The easy choice was to shake her head. She had already received the scholarship. She had already crossed the stage. She had survived the part she feared most. Then her eyes passed over the families in the front rows. She thought of the empty seat that had always followed her into ceremonies, graduations, parent nights, award dinners. She looked at Daniel. Will you stay right there? I'm not moving. Annie stepped toward the microphone. Her first words came softly. Thank you. The audience settled. She held the certificate against her body. I had something planned in case anybody asked me to speak, but I forgot all of it. A few people smiled, so I'll just say this. Annie glanced down once before continuing. I almost didn't come today. Daniel's attention sharpened. Annie had never told anyone from the foundation that. I knew I had won the scholarship, she said, and I knew I should be proud. But sometimes it's hard to feel proud when you keep comparing what you don't have to what everybody else seems to have. Several faces in the audience changed. Annie continued, I don't have parents waiting for me after this. I don't have family here taking pictures. And for a long time I thought admitting that hurt meant I wasn't strong enough. Her voice caught. She stopped. Daniel stayed exactly where he was. Annie looked toward him, then returned to the microphone. Today I asked someone to walk with me. She paused again. I think that might have been harder than walking alone. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. The applause started before Annie had fully stepped away from the microphone. This time she did not shrink from it. She stood beside Daniel with the certificate held securely in her hands and allowed herself to hear what the audience was giving her. When they finally turned toward the stairs, Daniel offered his arm again. Annie looked at it, then at him. I think I can walk down by myself. Daniel nodded. I think you can too. She took one step, then stopped. But you can still come. Daniel smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Daniel stayed one step behind Annie as they left the stage. He did not touch her unless she reached for him first, and this time she did not. The certificate rested against her chest while the applause continued behind them, softer now as the announcer prepared to call the next recipient. At the bottom of the stairs, Annie stopped near the curtain and looked down at the navy folder in her hands. Daniel waited beside her. I really said all that into a microphone, she murmured. You did. In front of everybody. That part usually comes with microphones. She gave him a look. You could pretend I didn't embarrass myself. I could, but then I'd be lying. Her mouth opened in disbelief before she realized he was smiling. That wasn't nice. You didn't embarrass yourself. You just said I did. No, I said I wouldn't pretend. Daniel nodded toward the stage. There's a difference. Annie shook her head, but a smile appeared anyway. Before she could answer, Paige came through the side corridor and wrapped both hands around Annie's forearm. That was amazing. Annie stiffened from surprise. What was? Everything. I talked for maybe 30 seconds. Exactly. I would have forgotten my own name. Trevor arrived behind Paige, slower this time. He kept his hands in his pockets and glanced toward Daniel before speaking. Hey, Annie. She turned. Trevor cleared his throat. About earlier. Paige crossed her arms. This should be good. He ignored her. I was being a jerk. Annie said nothing. I thought I was being funny, he continued. I wasn't. Daniel watched without interfering. Trevor glanced at Annie's certificate. Congratulations. You earned it. Annie studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Thank you. Trevor appeared relieved. Paige looked at him. See? That wasn't painful. Please stop helping. I'm enjoying this. The exchange made Annie laugh. And Trevor eventually did too. A volunteer called the students back toward their assigned seats, and Paige touched Annie's arm once more before leaving. Come sit with us when you're done. Annie nodded. I will. When they were alone again, Daniel said, You handled that well. What was I supposed to do? You had options. I could have made him feel bad. You could have. Annie looked toward the corridor where Trevor had disappeared. I already know what that feels like. Daniel regarded her for a second longer than usual. That's a useful thing to remember. Annie shifted the certificate under one arm. My grandmother used to say you learn more about somebody by what they do after they're embarrassed than by what they do before. Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked. You probably would have been afraid of her. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Should I ask why? She had opinions. I've met people with opinions. She told them to your face. Now I'm definitely sorry I missed her. Annie smiled, but the expression faded when her eyes moved toward the rows of families beyond the curtain. A mother was fixing her daughter's hair for another photograph. Nearby, a father held flowers while speaking to someone on his phone. Daniel noticed the change. You all right? Yeah. It came too quickly. He waited. Annie looked down at the folder. I just wish she could have seen it. Your grandmother? She nodded. She would have made a big deal out of this. Probably too big. What would she have done? Made me stand in the kitchen while she took 50 pictures. Then she would have sent them to people I've never met. Daniel smiled. Sounds efficient. She still had one of those old photo albums, actual printed pictures. My generation remembers those. You're 50, not 90. Thank you for the clarification. Annie laughed again, but her eyes remained wet. I used to complain when she took pictures, she said. Now I wish I had complained less. Daniel let the sentence remain between them without rushing to make it easier. After a moment he asked, Do you have anyone who can take one today? Annie glanced at him. A picture? Yes. I guess somebody from the school will send me the official one. That's not what I asked. She thought about it. Mrs. Carter is here somewhere. Then we should find her. You don't have to. I know. Daniel had barely finished when a woman's voice called from several yards away. Annie Johnson. Annie turned so quickly the folder nearly slipped from her hands. Mrs. Eleanor Carter was making her way toward them through the side aisle, carrying a purse, a folded program, and the expression of someone trying very hard not to let emotion interfere with her dignity. Annie's face changed at once. Mrs. Carter. The older woman reached her and opened her arms. Annie stepped into the embrace without hesitation. Mrs. Carter held her for several seconds before pulling back and placing both hands on Annie's shoulders. You made me ruin my makeup. I'm sorry. No, you are not. Annie laughed. Mrs. Carter took the scholarship folder and examined it as if verifying something she had known all along. There it is. Annie looked at her. You knew I'd get it. I knew you had earned a fair chance at it. Those are different things. Then Mrs. Carter turned toward Daniel. Mr. Wright. Mrs. Carter. She extended her hand. Thank you for what you did. Daniel shook it. She asked. I said yes. Mrs. Carter gave him a measured look. A surprising number of people fail at that second part. Daniel had no answer ready. Mrs. Carter returned her attention to Annie. Now, I need a photograph before you disappear. Annie made a face. You sound like Grandma. I'll take that as a compliment. It was. Mrs. Carter handed Daniel her phone. Would you mind? Daniel accepted it. Of course. Annie blinked. You're making a billionaire take our picture? Mrs. Carter positioned herself beside Annie. He seems capable. Daniel looked at the phone screen. This may be the most pressure I've been under all week. You fund scholarships, Annie said. You can press a button. That confidence in me is touching. Mrs. Carter laughed and put an arm around Annie. Daniel took several photographs. After the third, Annie reached for the phone. That's enough. Mrs. Carter did not move. One more. You said one picture. I changed my mind. Daniel raised the phone again. This time Annie did not force a formal smile. Mrs. Carter said something too quietly for Daniel to hear, and Annie laughed, just as he took the picture. When he lowered the phone, he knew immediately that it was the one they would keep. Mrs. Carter looked at the image and nodded. That one. Annie examined it. Her smile faded into something more thoughtful. What? Mrs. Carter asked. Annie touched the screen lightly. Nothing. Daniel understood before she explained. It was not an official photograph beneath a foundation banner. No one had arranged their posture. No one was holding flowers. It was simply Annie beside a woman who had shown up for her, laughing with a scholarship certificate tucked between them. Mrs. Carter handed the phone back to Daniel. Now you. He looked puzzled. Me? You walked up there with her. Get over here. Daniel glanced at Annie. She smiled. You heard her. For once that afternoon, Daniel followed instructions without argument. A volunteer offered to take the phone. Daniel stood on Annie's other side, while Mrs. Carter remained beside her. The three faced the camera. Just before the picture was taken, Annie looked from Mrs. Carter to Daniel. For the first time since arriving that morning, she was not thinking about who had failed to come. She was thinking about who had chosen to stay. By the time the ceremony ended, Annie had stopped checking the auditorium doors. She noticed that only after most of the families had already begun filing toward the reception area, chairs scraped against the floor, phones came out again, and students gathered in clusters to compare certificates and pose for more pictures. Mrs. Carter had been pulled into a conversation with another teacher near the aisle, and Daniel was speaking with two members of the scholarship committee. Annie stood a few feet away, holding the navy folder against her side. For once, she did not feel an urgent need to leave first. Paige came over carrying 2 paper cups of punch. I stole you one before Trevor drinks everything. Annie accepted it. That sounds believable. He's on his 3rd cookie too. Also believable. Paige glanced toward Daniel. So, are you famous now? Annie nearly choked on her drink. Absolutely not. You were on stage with Daniel Wright. He walked with me. That's all. Paige tilted her head. That is not going to be all once people start posting pictures. Annie's smile disappeared slightly. Paige noticed. Hey, I didn't mean that in a bad way. I know. You did great. Annie looked down at the cup. I almost didn't, but you did. Before Annie could answer, Trevor appeared with a small plate in one hand. Paige looked at the cookies. I knew it. Trevor ignored her and turned to Annie. My mom wants to meet you. Annie blinked. Why? She heard your speech. That doesn't answer the question. Trevor gave an awkward shrug. She cried. Paige smiled. Now that I believe. Trevor pointed toward a woman standing near the reception tables. She said what you said about being afraid to ask for help reminded her of when she first went back to college after my dad left. Annie's expression softened. Oh, she wants to congratulate you. If that's okay. Annie glanced toward the woman, who gave her a small wave from across the room. Yeah, Annie said. That's okay. Trevor nodded and headed back toward his mother. Paige watched him go. He's still annoying. I noticed, but maybe less annoying than this morning. Barely. They both laughed. Daniel finished his conversation and came toward them. He held his phone in one hand, his expression less formal than it had been during the ceremony. Annie, do you have a minute? She nodded. Paige immediately stepped away. I'm going to rescue a cookie before Trevor takes the last one. Daniel waited until she was out of hearing distance. There's something I want to tell you before you see it somewhere else. Annie's face tightened. What happened? Nothing bad. That usually comes right before something bad. Daniel gave her a brief smile. Fair point. He turned his phone so she could see the screen. A photograph from the stage had already been posted by the foundation's media team. Annie was standing beside Daniel with the certificate in her hands. The image showed the audience behind them, several people on their feet. The caption read, "Right Future Scholars Foundation celebrates Annie Johnson, one of this year's outstanding scholarship recipients." Annie studied it. "That's not terrible. I'm glad to hear our communications department passed inspection." She looked closer. "What?" Daniel scrolled down. A local news account had reposted the image with a different caption. "Orphaned Black Teen Walks Scholarship Stage with Billionaire Benefactor." Annie's expression changed. Daniel watched her carefully. She read it twice. Then she handed the phone back. "That was fast." "I know. They couldn't just write my name. They did farther down. That's not what people read first." "No." Annie looked across the reception area. Several students were laughing near a table covered with white cloth. Mrs. Carter was still speaking with a teacher. Nothing in the room had changed, but something in Annie's posture had. Daniel said, "I've already asked our staff not to use language like that." "Why?" "Because you're not a headline about misfortune." She gave him a skeptical look. "I am an orphan." "Yes." "And I'm black." "Yes." "And you're a billionaire." "Unfortunately, that part is also accurate." Despite herself, Annie smiled. Daniel continued, "Facts can still be used badly." She looked at him. "They made it sound like that's why I got the scholarship." "I know. Like the important thing is that I'm poor and alone." Daniel nodded. Annie's fingers tightened around the cup. "I worked for this. I know that too. You keep saying that, because you keep needing to hear it." That stopped her. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket. "You had one of the strongest applications in the program. You were selected before I knew anything about you beyond your name and a finalist packet." Annie looked toward the floor. "I still hate it." "You're allowed to. What am I supposed to do about it?" Daniel considered his answer. "You can't control every caption. That's convenient. It's also true." She looked up sharply, but his expression made it clear he was not dismissing her. "What you can control," he continued, "is whether somebody else gets to decide what your story means." Annie leaned one shoulder against the wall beside her. "That sounds like something people say when they already have power." Daniel accepted that without defensiveness. "You're right." She had not expected the answer. He continued, "So let me say it differently. If somebody reduces you to the worst thing that happened to you, correct them. If somebody reduces you to the help you received, remind them what you did with the opportunity. And if someone insists on misunderstanding you after that, stop spending energy trying to earn fairness from them." Annie looked at him for several seconds. "My grandmother used to say something like that." "What did she say?" "That some people ask questions because they want the truth, and some ask because they want permission to keep the answer they already decided on." Daniel nodded slowly. "Your grandmother and I would have had interesting conversations. She would have argued with you. I'm beginning to think that ran in the family." Annie smiled. Mrs. Carter approached them carrying her purse and coat. "I'm leaving before somebody asks me to help clean up." Annie laughed. "You're terrible. I taught 32 years. I've stacked enough folding chairs." Then she looked at Daniel. "May I borrow Annie for a moment?" Daniel stepped aside. "Of course." Mrs. Carter linked her arm through Annie's and walked with her toward the quieter end of the lobby. "I heard about the headline," she said. Annie gave her a tired look. "Does everyone know everything immediately now?" "Apparently." "I hate it." "I know. They found 3 things to call me before they got to my name." Mrs. Carter stopped walking. Annie looked at her. The older woman's expression sharpened, not with anger at Annie but with recognition. "Then make them learn your name." Annie said nothing. Mrs. Carter continued, "Not by shouting louder than everybody, by doing something with that scholarship they can't ignore." Annie looked back toward the reception area. Daniel was speaking with a staff member again, but he glanced over briefly and caught her eye. Mrs. Carter followed her gaze. "That man did something decent today." "He did. Don't turn it into a debt." Annie looked at her. "You hear me?" "Yes. Gratitude is good. Owing somebody your identity is not." Annie nodded slowly. Mrs. Carter squeezed her arm. "You earned the scholarship. He gave you company for a walk. Keep those 2 truths in the right order." Later that evening, after the auditorium had emptied and the foundation staff had begun packing banners into rolling cases, Daniel sat in the back seat of his car and opened the scholarship finalist file on his tablet. He found Annie's application. Her grades came first, then her recommendations, then the essay. He read the first page, then the second. By the time the car reached downtown Atlanta, he had already made one decision. Annie Johnson would never be used as a publicity story by his foundation. The second decision took longer. He opened a message to the program director and typed, "Would Annie be eligible for the formal mentorship track this fall?" He paused before sending it, not because he doubted her, because for the first time that day, Daniel understood that walking beside someone meant knowing when not to take the next step for them. He sent the message anyway, with one additional sentence, "Only if she chooses it." By late August, the photograph from the scholarship ceremony had almost stopped following Annie everywhere. Almost. It still appeared when someone searched her name online, usually beside a headline about Daniel Wright, but the first week of college gave people newer things to talk about. Dorm assignments, class schedules, dining plans, parking permits, fraternity events, professors with impossible reading lists. Annie preferred that. For the first time in months, she could enter a building without wondering whether somebody recognized the blazer from the stage. Her new campus sat a few miles north of downtown Atlanta, with red brick academic buildings, old trees shading the sidewalks, and students moving between classes carrying laptops and insulated coffee cups. Annie had visited twice before orientation, yet arriving with 2 suitcases made the place feel different. Everything she owned for the semester fit inside them. One held clothes, mostly thrift store purchases she had collected over the summer. The other carried books, toiletries, an iron, a framed photograph of her grandmother, and 3 plastic food containers Mrs. Carter insisted every college student needed. Her roommate, Lauren, arrived 40 minutes later with both parents and an SUV packed so tightly that Annie wondered whether they were moving into the dorm permanently. Lauren's mother entered carrying a bedside lamp. "Where do you want this, honey?" "By the desk." Her father followed with a television. "You sure this isn't too big?" Lauren laughed. "Dad, you bought it." Annie sat on her bed arranging notebooks while the family made several trips downstairs. Lauren eventually noticed Annie's side of the room was already finished. "You're fast." "I didn't bring much." Lauren looked around, then seemed to realize how that might sound. "I brought too much." "Definitely." They both laughed, and the awkwardness passed. Annie liked her. That mattered more than whether Lauren owned 6 pairs of shoes Annie could never justify buying. The differences became harder to ignore during the first month. Students ordered rides across campus when rain started. Annie carried an umbrella. A professor announced that the newest edition of a political science textbook was required. Annie checked the bookstore price, closed the page, and spent the evening finding a used copy online. When classmates talked about going home for Labor Day, Annie said she was staying to study. Nobody asked twice. She also worked 3 evenings a week at a grocery store about 20 minutes away by bus. The scholarship covered tuition, housing, and part of her meal plan, but shampoo still cost money. So did laundry, winter clothes, phone service, and everything else people rarely mentioned when discussing a full opportunity. Annie kept a notebook in the top drawer of her desk. Rent, covered. Tuition, covered. Meal plan, mostly covered. Everything else. Her problem, she preferred seeing the numbers written down. Numbers could be managed. People were harder. At the first scholarship networking dinner of the semester, Annie entered the hotel ballroom wearing the same navy blazer from the ceremony. Mrs. Carter had repaired the loose thread at one cuff before Annie moved into the dorm. "You are not throwing away a good jacket because somebody might know it isn't new," she had said. So Annie wore it. She regretted the decision within 15 minutes. The dinner was held at a downtown hotel overlooking Peachtree Street. White tablecloths covered round tables set with more silverware than Annie normally used in a week. She found her assigned seat between 2 scholarship recipients she had met only once. Across from her sat a young woman named Madison, whose father owned several medical offices in North Georgia. Madison smiled at Annie's blazer. "That's cute." "Is it vintage?" Annie glanced down. "No." The student beside Madison looked at the cuff. "More like thrift." He said it quietly, but not quietly enough. Madison pressed her lips together as if trying not to laugh. Annie felt heat move across her face. She opened her menu even though she had already read it. A waiter arrived with salads, giving her something else to focus on. Annie picked up the fork closest to her plate. Then she noticed everyone else using a different one. She put it down, picked up the other. The movement was small, but Madison saw it. "First donor dinner?" Annie looked at her. "Yeah, you'll get used to them." There was nothing openly cruel in the words. That somehow made them worse. Annie ate 3 bites before excusing herself. In the restroom, she stood at the sink and examined the blazer in the mirror. The fabric looked older beneath hotel lighting than it had in her dorm. For a moment, she considered taking it off. Then she heard her grandmother's voice in memory. Dignity doesn't come with a price tag. Annie touched the repaired cuff. I know, she whispered. Know what? She turned. Daniel Wright stood outside the restroom entrance near the corridor, speaking with a Foundation employee. He had apparently heard the last 2 words as Annie stepped out. Nothing. Daniel dismissed the employee with a nod and walked over. You disappeared from dinner. I used the restroom. For 12 minutes? Annie frowned. Do billionaires time everybody's bathroom breaks? Only scholarship recipients who look like they're planning an escape. I'm not escaping. Daniel glanced toward the ballroom doors. Then why are you standing out here? Annie adjusted the cuff of her blazer. Needed a minute. He noticed the movement. Something happen? No. Daniel waited. Annie hated that he had become good at recognizing that particular answer. Finally, she said, somebody made a comment about my jacket. What kind of comment? It doesn't matter. You came out here, so it mattered enough. She looked past him toward the windows overlooking downtown. They asked if it was vintage. Daniel waited for the rest. Then somebody said it looked thrifted. He glanced at the blazer. Is it? Annie looked offended. Yes. How much? $22. Daniel nodded. Mine cost considerably more, and appears to be doing the same job. Annie almost smiled. That's not the point. I know. She folded her arms. They know things I don't. Such us? Which fork to use without checking everybody else first. What to say at donor dinners. How to talk about summer trips and internships their parents arranged. They walk into places like this and don't have to think about every little thing. Daniel studied her face. Annie continued before she could stop herself. Sometimes I feel like everyone can tell. Tell what? That I'm not from their world. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. You aren't. Annie blinked. That was supposed to help? No, this part is. He nodded toward the ballroom. You don't need to become them to sit at the same table. Annie looked at the closed doors. That sounds easy when you've been doing this for years. It isn't easy. You never look uncomfortable. That's because I practiced. She gave him a doubtful expression. Daniel adjusted one cuff. Half the people in that ballroom are pretending they know exactly what they're doing. The other half practiced longer. What if they still think I shouldn't be there? Then let them think. Annie shook her head. You can say that because nobody's going to question why Daniel Wright is invited to a Wright Foundation dinner. Fair. The answer surprised her. Daniel continued. So don't borrow my confidence. Build your own. How? He opened the ballroom door. Start by going back to your seat. Annie did not move. Daniel held the door without rushing her. And if somebody comments on my clothes again, ask them why they're so interested in your sleeves. That brought a real laugh. Annie looked toward the tables inside. Then she straightened the blazer once, not to hide it, but to settle it comfortably across her shoulders. She walked through the doorway. Daniel followed several steps later. At dinner, Annie picked up the wrong fork again. This time she did not put it down. Over the next several months, Annie began to understand that confidence was less a feeling than a habit. It did not arrive all at once, and it rarely appeared when she needed it most. It had to be practiced in ordinary places, often when nobody was watching. Daniel made sure of that. Their mentorship meetings were usually simple. Sometimes they met in a coffee shop near campus. Other times she went to the foundation office after class and found him between meetings, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading documents at a conference table. He never turned the sessions into speeches. Instead, he gave her small assignments. Introduce yourself first. To who? To whoever enters the room before I do. That's the assignment? That's the assignment. Annie looked unconvinced. Daniel nodded toward the glass doors of the foundation office. Most people wait for someone important to speak first. Don't. The first time she tried, she stumbled over her own name. By the 5th time, she did not. Another afternoon, Daniel took her to a donor reception and said, You're going to ask one question before you leave. One question about what? Something you actually want to know. That sounds dangerous. It usually is. She ended up asking a retired judge why so many low-income defendants accepted plea agreements before understanding the long-term consequences. The judge paused, then spent nearly 15 minutes answering her. Afterward, Annie whispered to Daniel. I thought he'd think I was rude. He thought you were prepared. There's a difference? There should be. Daniel also corrected smaller things. Not because he wanted Annie to imitate wealthy people, but because he understood how quickly unfamiliar rules could be used to make someone feel inadequate. If someone offers you a business card, read the name before putting it away. Why? Because people notice when you treat what they hand you like it matters. He taught her how to enter a room without rushing, how to shake hands firmly without turning it into a contest, and how to stop apologizing before asking a reasonable question. One evening she caught herself saying, "Sorry, can I ask?" Daniel lifted one finger. She stopped. What? You've apologized 3 times in 10 minutes. I have not. You apologized for being 5 minutes early. I thought you were busy. I am busy. Exactly. That still doesn't make arriving early a moral failure. Annie rolled her eyes. Daniel smiled. Try again. She sighed. Can I ask you something? Much better. The lessons went both ways. Annie noticed that Daniel treated nearly everyone the same way when nobody was paying attention. He thanked the receptionist by name. He held the elevator for maintenance staff. He once delayed a meeting because an older security guard was struggling with a damaged access badge and Daniel refused to walk past without helping. You do that a lot, Annie said afterward. Do what? Stop for people. Daniel glanced at her. Shouldn't everyone? No. The answer made him think. A week later, they were having lunch at a small diner near campus when Annie noticed him leave a generous tip. That's a lot. The waitress kept our coffee full. She brought you 2 cups. That's 2 more than I wanted to make myself. Annie smiled. Daniel folded the receipt and said, How you treat someone who can do nothing for you tells me more than any resume ever will. She remembered the sentence. She also remembered that evening when she returned to the grocery store for a late shift and watched her manager speak sharply to an older employee who worked in produce. Annie finished stocking shelves, then quietly helped the man move 2 heavy boxes before clocking out. Nothing dramatic happened. No one applauded. That was why the lesson stayed with her. By spring, Annie's schedule had become harder to manage. Classes during the day, grocery shifts 3 nights a week, foundation meetings twice a month, and hours of studying squeezed into whatever remained. Daniel began noticing the signs before she admitted anything. She arrived at one meeting carrying a coffee she barely touched. You look tired. I'm fine. You're using that word incorrectly again. Annie opened her notebook. Can we talk about internship applications? Daniel did not move on. How many hours are you working? Not that many. How many? She hesitated. 28 this week. With a full course load? I need the money. For what? For normal things. Suchas? Annie's expression hardened. Laundry. My phone. Transportation. Food when my meal plan runs out. Things people need. Daniel nodded slowly. And your grades? Still good. That wasn't my question. They're fine. He could hear the exhaustion beneath the irritation. Daniel closed the folder in front of him. I can cover those expenses. Annie looked at him immediately. No, I'm not asking you to pay me back. That makes it worse. How? Because then I owe you something I can't calculate. You don't owe me anything. Annie leaned forward. You don't get to decide how that feels for me. Daniel stopped. The sentence landed cleanly. Annie lowered her voice. I appreciate what you've done. I do. But I don't want every hard thing in my life solved because you can write a check. I was trying to help. I know. Then why are you angry? Because I don't want to become somebody who can't tell where her own work ends and somebody else's money begins. Daniel said nothing for several seconds. Annie looked down at her notebook. I don't want to owe you my life. You don't. Then don't buy it for me. The words hung between them longer than she intended. She immediately regretted how harsh they sounded. Daniel, I didn't mean... No. She looked up. You meant it. His voice carried no offense. He pushed the folder aside. And I needed to hear it. Annie's shoulders loosened slightly. Daniel rested his forearms on the table. All right. No check. She nodded. But I still think 28 hours is too much. So do I. Then what do you need? Annie expected another financial suggestion. Instead, Daniel waited. She turned the question over. What did she need that money could not simply purchase? After a moment, she said, I need to stop feeling like every room has rules everybody learned before I got there. Daniel listened. I need to stop thinking one mistake will expose me. I need to be able to talk to people who have more money, better clothes, better connections, and not spend the whole conversation wondering if they can tell I came in through a scholarship. Daniel's expression softened. Annie continued, quieter now. Teach me how to stay in rooms where people think I shouldn't be there. Daniel nodded once. That I can do. She gave him a cautious smile. No surprise invoices? None. No new wardrobe? Not unless you ask. No pretending you know what's best for me? Daniel considered that one. I can promise to work on it. Annie laughed. Fair enough. He reopened the internship folder. All right, first lesson. I thought we already had the lesson. That was your lesson for me. Daniel slid a list of firms across the table. Now here's mine for you. Annie looked down. What? Stop applying only to places where you think you'll be comfortable. She looked up again. Daniel smiled. You asked me to teach you how to stay in difficult rooms. He tapped the first name on the list. Start by entering one. The first firm on Daniel's list was a legal aid organization on the south side of Atlanta. Annie almost removed it from her application list twice before finally pressing submit. She had expected an interview request a week later. Instead, the email arrived the next morning. We would like to meet with you. Annie read it 3 times. Then she called Daniel. You were right. That sounds serious. I got an interview. With the legal aid office? Yes. And I hate that you were right. Daniel laughed softly. You'll survive. The interview took place on a Thursday afternoon. Annie wore the navy blazer again, this time with a simple black skirt and the only pair of low heels she owned. Before leaving campus, she stood in front of the mirror and adjusted the jacket. She remembered Daniel's advice. Don't enter a room trying to prove you belong. So she stopped adjusting the sleeves and left. The office was smaller than she expected. There were no polished reception desks or framed photographs of famous attorneys. The waiting area had 2 chairs, a water cooler, and a shelf filled with pamphlets about housing, benefits, education, and family services. A woman named Renee Brooks interviewed her. Renee was in her late 40s and had worked there for more than 20 years. After the usual questions, Renee leaned back. Why law? Annie had prepared an answer. She decided not to use it. Because I've seen what happens when people don't understand the rules. Renee watched her. Go on. People hear a decision and think it's final because they don't know they can appeal it. They sign something because they're afraid not to. They miss a deadline because they don't have anyone explaining what the deadline means. Renee nodded. And you think lawyers fix that? Sometimes. Sometimes? Annie smiled slightly. Sometimes lawyers make people feel like they're supposed to be grateful just because somebody explained the form. Renee laughed. That's a dangerous answer. I'm sorry. Renee raised an eyebrow. Annie caught herself. Right, I did it again. What? Apologized. Renee smiled. Daniel Wright taught you that one? Annie looked surprised. You know him? Everybody in Atlanta legal aid knows Daniel Wright. That answer made Annie sit a little straighter. Renee continued. Don't worry. Your application stands on its own. The internship offer came 2 days later. Annie accepted. For the next several months, she spent part of her week working at the legal aid office. She learned quickly that the law rarely arrived in neat packages. A housing dispute could involve unpaid wages. A school issue could become a family crisis. A missed appointment could be caused by a bus route that stopped running early. One afternoon, Annie was sorting intake forms when she noticed a young girl sitting on a chair outside one of the consultation rooms with her mother. The girl held a backpack against her chest. Annie walked past once. Then again. On the 3rd pass, the girl looked up. Are you a lawyer? Not yet. The girl nodded as though that answered something important. Are you waiting for someone? My mom. Annie sat in the empty chair beside her. The girl glanced at the clock. I don't like waiting by myself. Annie looked at her. Then you don't have to. They sat together until the mother came out. It was a small moment, but Annie carried it with her. That evening, she told Daniel about it over coffee. He listened without interrupting. She asked if I was a lawyer. Were you tempted to say yes? No. Good. I told her I wasn't. What did she say? Nothing. Daniel smiled. And yet, you remember the conversation? Annie nodded. She was nervous. So were you once. Annie looked at him. I know. Daniel took a sip of coffee. Sometimes people remember less about what you tell them than whether they had to face something alone. Annie stared at her cup. That's what I keep thinking about. What? That day at the ceremony. Daniel waited. I thought I was asking you to do something for me. You were. I thought it was just about the stage. It was. She looked up. But it wasn't only that. Daniel did not answer. Annie continued. I think I wanted somebody to prove that being alone in a room didn't mean I had to feel alone. Daniel nodded slowly. That's a better understanding than most people reach in a lifetime. She smiled. Don't make it sound so dramatic. I'm not. The semester continued. Annie became more comfortable speaking in class. She started raising her hand even when she was not completely certain of the answer. She joined the campus pre-law association and volunteered for a student legal clinic. Then came a group project in her political science course. The professor assigned 4 students to each group. One student, Madison, looked at the list and frowned. Wait, we're together? Annie looked up. Madison recognized her immediately from the scholarship dinner. Oh, right. Another student laughed. Madison lowered her voice. I just thought we'd have different schedules. We do, Annie said. So how are we going to make this work? We schedule around them. Madison looked surprised by the answer. What if it doesn't? Then we change the schedule. The other students began discussing the assignment. Annie opened her laptop. She could feel the old instinct telling her to stay quiet, wait for someone else to lead, avoid drawing attention. She ignored it. I'll handle the research section, she said. Madison glanced over. You sure? Yes. And the presentation? I can do that too. Madison nodded. Okay. Nothing terrible happened. No one laughed. No one told Annie she did not belong. The fear had simply been waiting for permission to disappear. A week later, Daniel met her outside the foundation office. You look different. That's vague. You used to walk into this building like you were trying not to touch anything. Annie smiled. And now? Now you walked past the receptionist without checking whether she wanted you to. I said hello. I noticed. They entered the elevator. Annie leaned against the wall. I got into the legal clinic. I heard. How? You sent me the email. Oh, Daniel smiled. You also got an A on your first major paper. You read that too? I have eyes. You're becoming a little intrusive. Occupational hazard. The elevator doors opened. They stepped into the lobby. A group of foundation staff stood near the reception desk discussing the upcoming annual scholarship review. One of them looked toward Annie. Miss Johnson, we'll need your availability next week. Annie nodded. Send me the times. The staff member smiled and walked away. Daniel watched Annie for a moment. She noticed. What? Nothing. That's not true. He smiled. You're starting to sound like me. Annie shook her head. No. She walked toward the conference room, then turned back. I'm starting to sound like myself. Daniel stopped. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. That's better. The annual scholarship review began in early spring, and for the first time Annie was invited to sit in on part of the foundation's planning session. She was not a board member and had no vote. Her role was simply to provide the perspective of a current scholar, something Daniel had requested after seeing how confidently she had handled the legal clinic. The meeting took place on the 22nd floor of the foundation's downtown office. Annie arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a notebook and a folder of statistics she had prepared for one of her classes. At the reception desk, the assistant pointed toward the conference room. They're already gathering. Annie thanked her and walked down the hall. When she entered, Daniel was speaking with a man she had never met. The man was in his early 60s. Tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a dark suit that looked deliberately conservative. He stood near the window with one hand resting on the back of a chair. Daniel noticed Annie first. Annie, come in. The man turned. Daniel introduced them. Charles Whitmore, chairman of the foundation board. Whitmore extended his hand. Miss Johnson. Mr. Whitmore. His handshake was brief. I've heard quite a bit about you. Annie smiled politely. Hopefully some of it was accurate. Daniel looked at her for half a second. Whitmore smiled. I like that. Annie took a seat near the end of the table. More board members entered over the next few minutes. Most were older than Annie by several decades. Some had backgrounds in banking, education, law, or corporate leadership. Annie recognized 2 names from foundation reports she had studied. Whitmore sat at the head of the table. Daniel took the seat to his right. The meeting began with numbers. How many scholarships had been awarded? How many students had graduated? How many had remained enrolled? How much the foundation had spent? Annie listened carefully. Everything appeared orderly. Then Whitmore opened the section on scholarship requirements. Our renewal standards remain unchanged, he said. Recipients must maintain full-time enrollment and satisfactory academic progress. Exceptions remain limited. Annie looked down at her notes. She had read the policy before coming. Limited how? She asked. Several people turned toward her. Whitmore looked directly at her. Excuse me? The exceptions. How limited are they? Daniel remained quiet. Whitmore folded his hands. We review hardship requests individually. What qualifies as hardship? That depends on the circumstances. Is there a written standard? Yes. Could scholars see it before they submit an appeal? Whitmore smiled. Of course. Annie opened her folder. I looked through the student handbook. It says appeals are considered case by case, but it doesn't list examples. Whitmore glanced at Daniel, then back to Annie. That flexibility allows the committee to use judgment. I understand. Do you? Yes. She paused. I'm just wondering how students know whether an appeal is worth making. A board member beside Whitmore spoke up. Students are encouraged to contact the program office. Annie nodded. I know. Whitmore leaned back. Miss Johnson, the foundation has supported thousands of students. We have to maintain standards. Without standards, a scholarship program becomes impossible to manage. I'm not arguing against standards. Good. I'm asking how students are supposed to understand them. Whitmore studied her. Perhaps your perspective is different because you're still a student. Annie heard the implication. Daniel did too. But before he could speak, Annie answered. That may be true. She closed her folder. That's why I was invited, isn't it? A brief silence followed. One board member lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Whitmore did not react. The meeting moved on. Afterward, people gathered in small groups near the coffee station. Annie remained at the table, organizing her notes. Daniel approached. You handled yourself well. Did I? Yes. Mr. Whitmore doesn't like me. Daniel glanced across the room. Whitmore was speaking with a banker near the windows. He doesn't know you well enough to like or dislike you. Annie gave him a look. He called me still a student. You are still a student. You know what he meant. Daniel did not argue. Annie lowered her voice. He thinks I'm asking questions because I don't understand how things work. Daniel said, That's possible. And you should keep asking. She looked at him. Even if it makes people uncomfortable? Especially then, if the question is fair. Before Annie could answer, Whitmore approached. Mr. Wright, may I speak with you? Daniel nodded. Whitmore looked toward Annie. Privately, Annie gathered her folder. I'll go, Daniel said. You don't have to. Whitmore waited. Annie understood the tension and chose not to make herself part of it. I'll see you later. She walked toward the elevator. The doors had just opened when she heard Whitmore say behind her, She's bright. Annie pressed the button. The doors began to close. She caught the next words before the gap disappeared. She's also becoming difficult. The doors shut. Inside the elevator, Annie stood alone with her folder against her chest. She did not feel angry. Not yet. She felt something more useful. She wanted to know what had made a simple question sound like a threat. Back in the conference room, Daniel remained near the table. Whitmore waited until the elevator indicator moved downward. You've become quite invested in her. Daniel looked at him. She's a scholarship recipient. She's more than that to you. Daniel said nothing. Whitmore continued. I understand why. The photograph, the ceremony, the story. It was moving. She earned the scholarship. I didn't say she didn't. You implied it. Whitmore sighed. I'm trying to protect the foundation. From what? From becoming something it was never designed to be. Daniel folded his arms. And what is that? A platform for every student who decides the rules should be rewritten because they don't like them. Daniel looked toward the empty elevator hall. She asked one question. Today. Whitmore picked up his folder. People who learn they can influence institutions rarely stop at one question. Daniel watched him walk toward the conference room door. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Whitmore stopped. That depends on what they want. Daniel's voice remained even. What do you think Annie wants? Whitmore turned back. Attention. Daniel shook his head. No. What then? Daniel looked toward the elevator. An answer. Whitmore gave a small dismissive smile. Those two things often look the same from the outside. He left. Daniel remained alone in the conference room. On the table sat Annie's forgotten pencil. He picked it up and placed it beside her notes. Then he looked at the scholarship policy still displayed on the screen. For years, he had considered those pages evidence of a successful program. Now, for the first time, he wondered what they looked like to someone who had no family money waiting behind them. The question unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. By the following Monday, Annie had not forgotten Whitmore's comment. She had also not decided what it meant. Instead of confronting him, she did what she had learned to do in the legal clinic. She looked for facts. During one of her afternoon shifts, Marcus Reed came into the office carrying a folder under his arm. Annie knew him from the Foundation's scholarship program. He was studying engineering and usually arrived at campus events with a backpack full of textbooks and a coffee he had forgotten to finish. Today he looked exhausted. "You okay?" Annie asked. Marcus ate the folder on the desk. "I got an email from the Foundation." Annie opened it. His scholarship had been suspended. She read the letter twice. "Why?" "I dropped one class." "Why?" Marcus rubbed his forehead. "My mom's been sick. I needed to work more hours for a while." Annie looked back at the letter. The language was formal and polite. Academic requirements. Full-time enrollment. Renewal eligibility. Temporary suspension. Nothing in it sounded cruel. That was what bothered her. "Did you appeal?" "I tried." "What did they say?" "They said the circumstances didn't meet the criteria." Annie looked up. "What criteria?" Marcus gave a tired laugh. "That's what I asked." "And?" "They told me to submit another request." "Did you?" "Yes." "What happened?" "They denied it." Annie closed the folder. "Let me see the policy." Marcus slid a printed copy across the desk. Annie read it carefully. The requirement was clear. Scholarship recipients had to remain enrolled full-time unless the Foundation approved an exception. She turned to the appeal section. There were several categories listed, but the language was broad enough to give the review committee considerable discretion. "Did you speak with anyone?" "Program coordinator." "What did they tell you?" "That rules are rules." Annie looked down again. The phrase bothered her. Rules are rules. It sounded final. It sounded like a door closing. Marcus picked up his folder. "I'll figure something out." "Wait." He stopped. "I want to understand this first." "You don't have to." "I know." Marcus gave her a tired smile. "You sound like Daniel." Annie smiled faintly. "That may be the nicest insult I've heard all week." Marcus laughed, then left. Annie remained at the desk. She opened the Foundation's public records and began comparing scholarship requirements with the experiences of other recipients. She did not make assumptions. She looked at enrollment statistics, renewal rates, appeal outcomes, and the categories of hardship that had been approved or denied. By the end of the afternoon, she had filled 6 pages. There was a pattern. Students who had enough financial support at home could reduce work hours when something went wrong. They could take fewer shifts, hire help, or absorb an unexpected expense. Students without that cushion often had to make a choice between staying enrolled full-time and dealing with a family emergency. The rule applied to everyone. The consequences did not. Annie stared at the spreadsheet on her laptop. She whispered, "That can't be enough." A voice behind her answered, "It may not be." She turned. Daniel stood a few feet away with his jacket over one arm. "You scared me." "I knocked. I didn't hear you." He looked at the papers spread across the desk. "What are you working on?" Annie hesitated. "Marcus Reed." Daniel's expression changed. "What happened?" She handed him the suspension notice. He read it without speaking. "Did you know about this?" "I knew there had been an appeal." "You knew?" "The program office flagged it for review." "And?" "They were handling it." Annie studied him. "Were they?" Daniel looked at the letter again. "I thought they were." "That's different." He nodded. "What do you think should happen?" "I don't know yet." "Good." Annie looked surprised. Daniel pulled a chair over. "If you already knew the answer, you wouldn't need to investigate." She opened her laptop again. "I found something." Daniel leaned closer. "Show me." She pointed to the numbers. "Look at renewal losses. Most of the students who lose scholarships for enrollment issues are students who work significant hours or have family responsibilities." Daniel read the figures. "Do we have the underlying data?" "Not all of it." "Can you get it?" "Not without asking." "Then ask." Annie hesitated. "What if Whitmore says no?" Daniel looked at her. "Then you'll know he said no." "That simple?" "No." He leaned back. "But information is more useful than suspicion." Annie nodded. They spent the next hour reviewing the policy together. Daniel asked questions but did not take over. Annie noticed that. You're not telling me what to do. You asked me to teach you how to stay in difficult rooms. And? You're in one. She looked at the documents. This isn't a room. It will be. The following week, Annie requested anonymized scholarship retention data through the proper foundation process. She did not ask for private student information. She did not contact anyone without permission. She wanted numbers that could be reviewed and verified. The response came 2 days later. Partial data only. Annie frowned. She forwarded the response to Daniel. He called her within minutes. Did they explain why? They said the information was confidential. Were you asking for names? No. Then ask for the policy governing access. Annie smiled. You really do enjoy this. I enjoy knowing what the rules actually say. That afternoon, she requested the policy. This time, the answer came from Whitmore's office. Mr. Whitmore would like to meet with you. Annie stared at the message. She showed it to Daniel. Should I go? Yes. Alone? Daniel paused. Then he said, Do you want me there? Annie considered it. No. He nodded. Then, go alone. The meeting took place the next morning. Whitmore sat behind a conference table with the policy document open in front of him. You've been requesting information. Yes. Why? I'm reviewing the hardship appeal process. For what purpose? To understand whether it works. Whitmore folded his hands. The foundation has operated successfully for years. I know. Then what exactly are you trying to prove? I'm not trying to prove anything. Whitmore studied her. You're becoming increasingly interested in our internal procedures. I'm a scholarship recipient. You're also a student. Yes. And not a board member. Annie nodded. I know. Then perhaps you should focus on your studies. Annie kept her voice measured. I am. Good. But I also think scholarship recipients should understand the rules governing their scholarships. Whitmore's expression tightened. They do. Then providing the policy shouldn't be a problem. For the first time, he leaned forward. Miss Johnson, institutions like this cannot function if every recipient believes they have the authority to challenge every decision. Annie met his eyes. I'm not challenging every decision. Not yet. The words hung between them. Annie closed her folder. May I ask you something? You already have. Do you think asking questions is disrespectful? Whitmore paused. No. Then what is the problem? His answer came slowly. The problem is that questions can become pressure. Annie stood. Then perhaps the answer should be strong enough to survive the question. Whitmore's expression hardened. Be careful. Annie gathered her papers. I am. She walked out without another word. In the hallway, she stopped beside the elevator and looked down at her notes. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of keeping her voice steady. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. Her phone vibrated before the doors closed. A message from Daniel. How did it go? Annie typed back. He told me to be careful. A few seconds passed. Then Daniel replied. Were you? Annie looked at the screen. She typed, yes. Then, after a moment, added, but I don't think he meant careful. Daniel's reply came almost immediately. Neither do I. The next meeting with Daniel did not begin with coffee. Annie walked into the foundation office carrying a folder under her arm and placed it on the table between them. Daniel looked at it. What happened? He told me to be careful. Daniel pulled out a chair. Sit. Annie sat. He said I was becoming too interested in the foundation's procedures. What did you say? That scholarship recipients should understand the rules that affect them. Daniel nodded. And? He asked what I was trying to prove. What did you tell him? That I wasn't trying to prove anything. Daniel leaned back. Did you ask for the data? Yes. And? He gave me part of it. Which part? Annie opened the folder, enough to make the problem harder to ignore. She spread several pages across the table. Daniel read the first sheet, then the next. Where did you get this? Public reports, internal documents I was given through the proper request process, and information Marcus agreed to share. I removed names from everything that didn't need names. Daniel looked impressed. You did this carefully. I had to. Why? Because if I make one mistake, they won't argue with the numbers. They'll argue with me. Daniel understood immediately. Annie pointed to one column. Look at the renewal losses. He followed her finger. Most of these students were working more than 20 hours a week. Yes. Family care? Several. Medical emergencies? A few. Daniel scanned the figures again. And the appeals? Most were denied. Most? Nearly all. He looked up. Why? That's what I'm trying to find out. Daniel was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, You're asking the right question. Annie closed the folder. I don't think you're going to like where it leads. Daniel looked at her. I may not. She leaned forward. You helped build this. I know. You approved the annual report. I know. Then you can't tell me this is just a problem with somebody else. Daniel's expression tightened. I'm not. You're still talking like you're outside of it. I'm trying to understand it before I make a decision. That's what everyone says when they're comfortable with the way things are. Daniel looked at her sharply. That's unfair. Annie immediately regretted the sentence, but she did not take it back. Maybe. No, Annie. You're right to question the policy. You're wrong if you think I'm protecting it because I don't care. Then why are you asking me to slow down? Because changing a foundation policy affects every student in the program. I need to know what we're changing, why we're changing it, and what happens afterward. They don't have months. I know. Marcus may have to leave school. I know. Annie pushed the papers toward him. Then that's why I don't understand why we're still talking about process. Daniel's voice became firmer. Because process matters. So does Marcus. I didn't say it didn't. But if you keep waiting for the perfect answer, people get hurt while we're preparing it. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. For several seconds, neither spoke. Annie looked at him. You taught me not to leave a room because somebody powerful wants me quiet. Daniel turned. That's not what I'm doing. It feels like it. I'm trying to protect the foundation. Annie stood too. I'm trying to protect the students. Daniel took a breath. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Then prove it. The words came out stronger than she intended. Daniel started at her. Annie picked up her folder. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't apologize. She stopped. I meant what I said. I know. He looked toward the papers. Give me 48 hours. For what? To review the policy with our legal team and finance department. And Marcus? I'll make sure his appeal is reviewed again. By whom? Not the same person who denied it. Annie studied him. Will you put that in writing? Daniel almost smiled. You really have been spending too much time around lawyers. I'm serious. I know. He sat back down. I'll put it in writing. Annie nodded. She gathered her folder, but before leaving she turned. Daniel? Yes? Do you remember what you told me at that first dinner? About the fork? She smiled despite herself. No, about treating people who can't do anything for you. Daniel waited. You said it tells you who somebody really is. I remember. I think that applies to institutions too. Daniel looked at her. How? An institution shows what it really believes when somebody asks it to make room for a person who has less power. She left before he could answer. The following morning, Daniel called an emergency meeting with the Foundation's General Counsel and Program Director. Whitmore was already there. He had received a copy of Annie's request. I think we're overreacting, Whitmore said. Daniel took his seat. Marcus Reed's scholarship was suspended under our current policy. Correct. He appealed. Correct. He was denied. Yes. Why? Whitmore glanced toward the program director. Because he didn't meet the exception criteria. Daniel looked at the document. What criteria? Whitmore leaned forward. The criteria approved by this board. Daniel tapped the page. This says the committee may consider exceptional circumstances. Yes. May? That is the language. Who decides what qualifies? The committee. Which committee? Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. Daniel, we have done this for years. That wasn't my question. A silence followed. The program director finally answered. The Scholarship Review Committee. Who chairs it? Whitmore looked at Daniel. I do. Daniel leaned back. For the first time, he saw the structure clearly. The rule did not explicitly say that poor students should lose their scholarships. It simply gave one group of people broad discretion over which hardships were considered worthy. He turned to the General Counsel. Can you review the policy for disparate impact? Whitmore immediately objected. That sounds like an accusation. It's a legal question. It's unnecessary. Daniel looked at him. Maybe. Whitmore lowered his voice. You're allowing one student to dictate the direction of the foundation. Daniel answered without hesitation. No. He looked at the file on the table. I'm allowing the evidence to do that. Whitmore leaned back. You're becoming emotionally involved. Daniel thought about Annie standing beside him on that stage, her hand trembling against his sleeve. Then he looked at the policy that had once seemed perfectly reasonable. Maybe I should have been. Whitmore's expression changed. Daniel, I built this foundation because I believed an opportunity could change a person's life. And it does. Then we need to make sure the opportunity survives the first serious setback. Whitmore shook his head. Rules are what make charity sustainable. Daniel looked directly at him. Rules are supposed to serve people. They also protect institutions. Then perhaps we've protected the institution too well. The meeting ended without a final decision. But Daniel did something that afternoon he had not done in years. He canceled a luncheon, then another meeting, then a dinner with donors. He asked for every scholarship appeal from the previous 3 years. Not summaries, not conclusion, the actual files. That evening, Annie received a message from him. Your request is moving forward. Legal review begins tomorrow. She stared at the screen. Then another message appeared, and Marcus's appeal is being reconsidered. Annie let out a breath and placed the phone beside her books. For the first time since this began, she allowed herself to believe that asking the question might actually change something. She did not know yet that Whitmore was already preparing to make sure the question came at a price. The next week began with a change Annie could feel before anyone explained it. People who had once greeted her casually at the foundation office became more formal. Meetings that used to include her were suddenly moved to times she was not available. An email about a student panel disappeared from her calendar, without explanation. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. At the legal clinic, Renee noticed instead. You look distracted. I'm not. Renee glanced over her glasses. You're organizing the same stack of papers for the 3rd time. Annie looked down. She had indeed placed the forms into 3 separate piles, then rearranged them twice. Something's happening at the foundation. Something always happens at a foundation. Not like this. Renee waited. Annie finally told her about the policy review, Marcus's appeal, and Whitmore's growing resistance. Renee listened carefully. When Annie finished, she said, Are you afraid? Annie considered the question. Yes. Good. Annie frowned. Renee smiled. Fear is useful when it makes you pay attention. It becomes a problem when it makes your decisions for you. Annie nodded. I just don't want to lose the scholarship. That's reasonable. And I don't want Marcus to lose his. That's also reasonable. I don't want people thinking I'm ungrateful. Renee leaned back. There it is. What? The part you need to be careful with. Annie waited. You can be grateful for an opportunity and still question the person who controls it. Those things can exist together. Annie looked at the forms on her desk. What if they decide I'm not worth the trouble? Renee answered without hesitation. Then make sure your work is strong enough that they have to argue with the work, not your character. That afternoon, Annie received an email from the foundation. Subject, Scholarship Program Review. She opened it. Dear Miss Johnson, due to the ongoing review of foundation policies, your participation in the upcoming student advisory session has been postponed. No explanation. No new date. Annie read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Daniel. He called within 5 minutes. You received the email. Yes. I'm sorry. Did you know they were doing that? No. Did Whitmore? I don't know. Annie sat back. Daniel, am I in trouble? No. How do you know? Because you haven't done anything wrong. That doesn't mean they can't make me pay for it. Daniel was silent. She heard the hesitation. What? I've been speaking with the board. And? The policy review is more complicated than I expected. That sounds like a no. It's not a no. It sounds like one. Daniel lowered his voice. Some donors are concerned about the direction of the foundation. Annie closed her eyes. Because of me? Not entirely, but partly. They're concerned about the publicity around the issue. Annie laughed once, without humor. So this is about the headlines again. Partly. She stood and began walking across her dorm room. What do they want? They want reassurance that the foundation is still financially responsible. Are the numbers bad? No. Then what are they afraid of? Daniel did not answer immediately. Change, he finally said. Annie stopped walking. Then maybe that's the problem. Daniel knew what she meant. That evening, Annie went to the library and opened every document she had collected. She did not look for something that would make Whitmore look guilty. She looked for what was true. She compared scholarship requirements with public financial reports. She checked the number of appeals, the number approved, the number denied. and the stated reasons. The more she read, the more uncomfortable she became. There was no single sentence proving anyone wanted poor students to fail. There was no written instruction saying minority students should receive less support. The problem was buried in the structure. A full-time requirement, a narrow definition of hardship, a discretionary appeal process, a review committee with no independent oversight. Each piece looked reasonable on its own. Together, they created a system in which students with fewer resources had less room to recover from ordinary life. Annie wrote one sentence at the top of a fresh page. A rule can be equal on paper and still be unfair in real life. She stared at it for a long time. Then she added examples beneath it. At 9 that night, Marcus called. "How's it going?" "I'm still working." "On my appeal?" "On the bigger issue." He was quiet. "Annie, you don't have to do this." "I know. I mean it." "So do I. You could lose your scholarship." Annie looked at the foundation documents spread across the library table. "I know. You scared?" "Yes." Marcus exhaled. "Me too." Annie smiled faintly. "That's not helping." "I wasn't trying to." They both laughed. Then Marcus said, "Whatever happens, thanks." Annie closed her notebook. "Don't thank me yet. I'm thanking you for listening." That sentence stayed with her after the call ended. The following morning, Daniel asked her to meet him at the foundation. When Annie entered his office, he was standing beside a table covered with folders. "I reviewed the appeals," he said. "All of them?" "The last 3 years." Annie looked at the stacks. "And?" Daniel handed her a document. 27 students lost or suspended their scholarships because of enrollment-related issues. She read the next line. 21 submitted hardship appeals. Of those, 4 were approved. Annie looked up. "Four?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to determine." She turned another page. Several cases involved family medical emergencies, caregiving responsibilities, sudden job loss, or housing instability. Annie felt anger rise, but she kept reading. Daniel watched her. "There's something else." She looked up. "What?" The Foundation's legal counsel found no requirement that hardship decisions be made by the board chairman. Annie stared at him. "So Whitmore chose the process." "Apparently." "Why?" "I don't know yet." Annie closed the file. "Then we need to find out." Daniel nodded. "We do." Before she could say anything else, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Charles Whitmore." Daniel answered. "Charles." Annie watched his expression change as he listened. He said almost nothing. Then, "I understand." A pause. "No, I'm not changing my position." Another pause. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I said I understand." He ended the call. Annie waited. What did he want? Daniel placed the phone on the desk. "He wants me to step back from the review." "Why?" "He says I'm too personally involved." Annie felt her stomach tighten. "And will you?" Daniel looked at the folders on the table, then at Annie. "No." But neither of them knew yet how much that decision was going to cost. The following morning, Daniel arrived at the foundation before most of the staff. He had barely taken off his coat when his assistant placed a folder on his desk. This came from Mr. Whitmore's office. Daniel opened it. Inside was a formal memorandum requesting that the scholarship review be transferred to an independent committee. At first glance, it looked reasonable. The language was professional, the recommendation carefully written, and the stated purpose was to avoid a conflict of interest. Daniel read the final paragraph twice. The proposed committee would consist of 3 board members and 2 outside advisors selected by the board. He set the paper down. Who chose the outside advisors? His assistant hesitated. "Mr. Whitmore's office." Daniel nodded. "Of course." Before he could say anything else, his phone rang. It was Annie. "Can you talk?" "Yes." "I found something." Daniel sat down. "What?" "I went through the public filings and the foundation reports again. There's a gap." "What kind?" "Scholarship appeals that were approved don't always appear in the annual statistics the same way as appeals that were denied." Daniel frowned. "Explain." "The reports list the number of appeals received and the number of students who received exceptions, but they don't explain how many requests were withdrawn before a formal decision." "And why does that matter?" "Because students may have been discouraged from continuing." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you have evidence?" "Not yet." "Then don't make the accusation." "I know." "Good. But I found something else." She sounded different now, more certain. There are internal emails referenced in 2 public records requests. The foundation said the records didn't exist. Daniel's expression changed. Where did you find the references? In archived court documents from a separate case involving a former scholarship recipient. Send me the case. I already did. His computer chimed. Daniel opened the attachment. The case was several years old. A former recipient had challenged the foundation after losing financial support following a family emergency. The lawsuit had been dismissed before trial, but one document caught Daniel's attention. A deposition mentioned internal guidance regarding hardship appeals. Daniel read the passage carefully. Annie. Yes? I see it. What? There was guidance. What kind? I don't know yet. He printed the page. Give me an hour. You sound worried. I am. The call ended. Daniel contacted the foundation's general counsel. Within 30 minutes, the legal department confirmed that older correspondence existed in archived records. The documents were retrieved before noon. Daniel read them alone. Then he read them again. The guidance had never been formally adopted as policy. It had circulated internally among senior administrators. It instructed reviewers to exercise caution when granting hardship exceptions because excessive approvals could weaken the perceived rigor of the scholarship program. That sentence alone would have been troubling. The next paragraph was worse. It suggested that exceptions should be limited to circumstances that were clearly extraordinary and independently verifiable. Daniel leaned back. What does that even mean? The counsel sitting across from him answered carefully. It gives reviewers considerable discretion. Who wrote this? We're still tracing the original draft. Was Whitmore involved? We don't know yet. Daniel looked at the signature page. There was no signature, but there was a distribution list. Charles Whitmore was on it. Daniel closed the folder. Find the original. The lawyer nodded. Annie arrived at the foundation shortly after 2. Daniel met her in a smaller conference room rather than his office. She saw the documents immediately. You found something? Yes. He placed the guidance on the table. Annie read it. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. So this existed. Yes, but it wasn't official policy. Not formally. That makes it worse. Daniel nodded. Why? Because people could use it without students knowing it existed. She looked up. Who wrote it? We're trying to determine that. Whitmore? We don't know. Annie tapped the distribution list. He received it. Yes. Did he act on it? We need evidence. She nodded. I know. Daniel studied her. You understand what happens if this becomes public. Annie looked at him. The foundation gets embarrassed. More than that. Donors may leave. Yes. Board members may resign. Possibly. And you could lose control of the foundation. Daniel did not answer. Annie folded her hands. Are you scared? Yes. She seemed surprised by the honesty. Daniel continued. I'm also angry. At Whitmore? At myself. Why? Because I trusted a system I never examined closely enough. Annie shook her head. You didn't create every decision. No, but you allowed people to make them under your name. Daniel looked down. That's true. Annie sat back. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, What happens to Marcus? Daniel opened another folder. His appeal is being reconsidered. By the same committee? No. Who? An independent review panel. Independent from Whitmore? Yes. Annie nodded. That's a start. Daniel looked at her. I need you to understand something. What? If this goes forward, your name may become part of it. Annie's expression tightened. I don't want publicity. I know. You promised I wouldn't become a publicity story. And I meant it. Then keep my name out unless there's no other choice. Daniel nodded. I will. Annie looked at the documents again. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't see this. I wouldn't ask you to. She gathered her notes. As she stood, Daniel said, Annie. She turned. You were right. About what? The institution. She waited. Rules can be equal on paper and still create unequal consequences. Annie gave a small nod. That's why I want to go to law school. Daniel smiled. I know. Outside the conference room, neither noticed the man standing at the far end of the corridor. Charles Whitmore had arrived without notifying Daniel's office. He had heard enough. He turned away before Annie stepped into the hallway. Back in his office, Whitmore closed the door and called someone whose number he had saved under a name rather than a title. I need the original records before Daniel gets them. The person on the other end asked, "And the girl?" Whitmore looked through the glass wall toward the corridor where Annie had just disappeared. "She stays out of this." "How?" Whitmore paused. "I'm not asking you to hurt her. I understand. I'm asking you to make sure the board understands she has a conflict of interest." The voice on the phone was quiet. "And if they ask for proof?" Whitmore looked down at the old memorandum on his desk. "Then we give them a reason to question why she became involved in the first place." He ended the call. Across the building, Daniel stood beside the window while Annie gathered her things. Neither of them knew that the next battle would not be about whether the scholarship rules were fair. It would be about whether the people who had benefited from those rules could control the story before the truth reached the board. Annie noticed the change before anyone told her about it. The next morning, her university email contained a message from the scholarship office asking her to attend a meeting regarding program participation and potential conflicts of interest. The wording was polite, but Annie had learned enough about institutions to recognize when a sentence was designed to sound harmless. She forwarded the email to Daniel. His response came quickly. "Don't go alone. I'll have counsel present." Annie typed back, "You said I could speak for myself." "You can. That doesn't mean you have to walk into a formal meeting without understanding your rights." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she replied, "Fine, but I'm answering for myself." The meeting took place that afternoon in a small conference room at the foundation. Daniel was there with the general counsel, Susan Miller. Annie sat across from them with her notebook open. Whitmore entered last. He placed a thin folder on the table. "Thank you for coming, Annie." She nodded. "You asked for the meeting." "I did. Then perhaps you can tell me why." Whitmore opened the folder. "There are concerns regarding your involvement in the Foundation's internal review. I was invited to participate. As a student representative." "Yes. You subsequently requested internal records. Through the proper process." Whitmore glanced at Susan. "Some of those requests involved matters beyond your role." Annie looked at him. "I asked for information about scholarship appeals. You also discussed individual cases with other recipients. Marcus came to the legal clinic. He asked for help. You became personally involved. I listened to him." Whitmore folded his hands. "That distinction may not matter. It matters to me." Susan spoke for the first time. "Mr. Whitmore, if there is a specific policy Annie violated, we should identify it." Whitmore looked at her. "This is not a disciplinary hearing." "Then what is it?" He did not answer immediately. Annie noticed the hesitation. "You said there was a conflict of interest." Whitmore nodded. "You received a scholarship from this foundation." "Yes." "You are also receiving mentorship from Mr. Wright." "Yes." "And you have been publicly associated with him." Annie understood. "You think that makes my questions invalid?" "I think it raises questions about your objectivity." Daniel finally spoke. "Charles, she disclosed every connection you just mentioned. That doesn't eliminate the concern." Annie looked at Whitmore. "Did you question the objectivity of students who were unhappy with a professor because they had a personal experience?" "This is different." "Why?" Whitmore's expression tightened. "Because you have a direct relationship with the Foundation's principal donor." Annie glanced at Daniel, then back at Whitmore. "Your problem isn't that I'm connected to Daniel. What is it then?" "You don't like what I'm asking." The room became quiet. Whitmore leaned back. "That is an assumption." "Then tell me I'm wrong." He did not. Susan looked down at her notes. Daniel remained still. Whitmore finally said, "Your scholarship will not be affected by this meeting." Annie noticed the wording. "Not by this meeting?" Whitmore looked at her. "You're very careful with words." "I've learned to be." Daniel's expression changed slightly. Whitmore closed the folder. "We'll consider the matter resolved for now." Annie stood. "Good." She picked up her notebook. As she reached the door, Whitmore said, "One more thing." She turned. "You should think carefully about how much you involve yourself in matters that could affect your future." Annie looked directly at him. "I am thinking carefully." She left. Daniel followed her into the hallway. "You all right?" "I'm angry." "Good." She looked at him. "Renee said something like that." "Renee is usually right." Annie lowered her voice. "He was warning me." "Yes." "About my scholarship?" "Maybe. Or about something else." Daniel nodded. "I think so." They walked toward the elevator. Annie stopped. "Daniel." "Yes?" "Did you know there was an original memo?" "No." "Did Whitmore?" "We're still trying to prove that." But he knew enough to be worried. Daniel did not disagree. The elevator arrived. Annie stepped inside. I want copies of everything. You'll get them. Not just what you think I should see. Daniel looked at her. Everything legally available. Yes. He nodded. That evening, Annie returned to her dorm and found an envelope tucked beneath her door. There was no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a document. At the top was an old Foundation letterhead. The date was nearly 4 years earlier. Annie read the first paragraph, then the second. Her stomach tightened. The document described recommended procedures for reviewing hardship appeals. It contained language almost identical to the internal guidance Daniel had shown her. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Ask who approved this. Annie turned the page. There was another line. Look at the committee minutes from October 14. She read it twice. Then she photographed the document and called Daniel. He answered immediately. Annie? I got something. What? I don't know who sent it. Are you alone? Yes. Don't send it to anyone else yet. She heard him stand. What does it say? She read the note aloud. Daniel was quiet. October 14, he repeated. Yes. I'll check the minutes. Daniel. What? If somebody is sending this to me, they want me involved. I know. And if Whitmore finds out, he may already know. Annie looked toward the hallway. I don't like this. Neither do I. She lowered her voice. Should I destroy it? No. Why not? Because if it's legitimate, it's evidence. Put it somewhere safe. Don't alter it. Don't forward it. Okay. And Annie? Yes? Do not meet anyone alone who claims to have information about the Foundation. She nodded even though he could not see her. I won't. The following morning, Daniel obtained the October 14 board minutes. At first, they appeared routine. Financial reports, scholarship totals, annual planning. Then he found the relevant section. A closed session had been held that afternoon. The minutes recorded a discussion about preserving scholarship standards and limiting discretionary exceptions. Daniel kept reading. The language was careful. Too careful. One sentence made him stop. The board had discussed whether the Foundation should adopt informal screening principles before hardship appeals reached the formal review committee. Daniel printed the page. Then he noticed something else. The initials beside the motion were not Whitmore's. They belonged to a former board secretary who had resigned 2 years later. Daniel searched the Foundation archives. The secretary's records were incomplete. Several pages were missing. He called Susan. I think we have a problem. What kind? Someone removed part of the historical record. Can you prove it? Not yet. Susan paused. Then don't accuse anyone. I know. Daniel looked at the printed minutes. But somebody knew exactly what they were doing. That afternoon, Annie received another anonymous message. This time it contained only 3 words. They know you know. She stared at the screen. Then she forwarded it to Daniel. He called immediately. Annie, listen to me. I'm listening. Whatever happens next, you stay out of the Foundation office until we understand who is sending these. But, no, this isn't about courage anymore. It's about protecting you from being pulled into something you didn't create. Annie looked at the scholarship certificate hanging above her desk. I'm not afraid of them. I know. Then why do I feel like I'm being pushed out? Daniel's voice softened. Because someone wants you to think you're alone. Annie closed her eyes. For a moment, she remembered the stage, the lights, the stairs, and the arm she had once been afraid to hold. Then she opened her eyes. I'm not. No, Daniel said. You're not. Neither of them knew that, across town, Charles Whitmore was preparing for the board meeting that could decide not only the future of the scholarship program, but Daniel's control over the Foundation itself. The board meeting began at 9 o'clock on Friday morning. By 8:45, every seat around the long conference table was occupied. Daniel sat near the center with Susan Miller beside him. Charles Whitmore sat opposite them, his folder closed, his hands resting on top of it. Annie was not in the room. Daniel had insisted on that. She watched from a smaller conference room on another floor with Renee and 2 members of the legal team. She had asked to attend, but Daniel had refused. You've done your part, he told her earlier. Now let the evidence speak. The meeting opened with the usual financial reports. Then Whitmore requested the floor. There has been considerable confusion surrounding the scholarship program, he began. I believe we need to separate legitimate concerns from emotional reactions. Daniel said nothing. Whitmore continued. Mr. Wright has become personally involved with one recipient. That recipient has subsequently challenged foundation procedures and requested internal information. We should consider whether the foundation has allowed personal relationships to influence institutional decisions. Several board members looked toward Daniel. He remained seated. Whitmore placed a document on the table. I recommend that Mr. Wright recuse himself from the scholarship program entirely. Susan slid another document forward. Before the board considers that recommendation, council should present the findings of the policy review. Whitmore frowned. This review was initiated by Mr. Wright. Yes, Susan replied, but the findings were conducted independently. She began explaining the results. The hardship policy had been applied inconsistently. The foundation's public language suggested that students facing serious personal or financial difficulties could request an exception. Internal guidance, however, encouraged reviewers to limit those exceptions to circumstances considered sufficiently extraordinary. The problem was not that the foundation had intentionally written a rule against poor students. The problem was that its process placed the burden of proving extraordinary hardship on students who often had the least ability to navigate the system. Susan presented the numbers. 27 scholarship suspensions over 3 years, 21 appeals, 4 approved, 17 denied. Several involved circumstances that would have been financially manageable for students with family support but devastating for students without it. A board member asked, "Was this intentional?" Susan answered carefully, "We found no written instruction directing reviewers to discriminate against any racial group or economic class." Whitmore leaned forward. "Then this entire discussion is being exaggerated." Susan continued, "However, the process created predictable disparities." Whitmore shook his head. "Predictable is not the same as intentional." "No," Susan said, "but it can still require correction." Daniel finally spoke. "That is why we're here." Whitmore turned toward him. "You've already made your position clear." Daniel nodded. "Yes. What happens if the board disagrees?" Daniel looked around the table. "Then I accept the board's decision." Whitmore appeared satisfied. Until Daniel added, "But I will not pretend the old system was working simply because we were comfortable with it." Susan then presented the October 14 minutes. The room changed. The discussion about informal screening principles had not been included in the foundation's later policy summaries. One board member frowned. "Who approved this?" Susan pointed to the minutes. "The motion was discussed during a closed session." Whitmore spoke quickly. "It was never adopted." "That's correct," Susan said. "Then it has no authority. Legally, perhaps not. But it demonstrates that senior leadership was discussing ways to limit hardship exceptions outside the formal policy." Whitmore looked at Daniel. "This is becoming absurd." Daniel did not respond. Susan placed another document on the table. The internal guidance was distributed to senior administrators and members of the scholarship committee. A board member picked it up. "Was Mr. Whitmore on the distribution list?" "Yes." Whitmore leaned forward. "I received hundreds of documents." "No one is accusing you of writing it," Susan said. "Then what exactly are you accusing me of?" "Nothing. We are presenting the record." That answer seemed to anger him more than an accusation would have. He looked around the table. "You're all allowing one student to create a crisis." Daniel shook his head. "No." Whitmore looked at him. Daniel continued. "She asked a question. The documents answered it." The room remained quiet. Then the chairman of the board, an older man named Robert Hayes, spoke. "Charles, did you know this guidance was being used by reviewers?" Whitmore hesitated. "I knew it existed." "Did you approve it?" "No." "Did you object to it?" Another pause. "No." Robert Hayes closed his folder. "That matters." Whitmore looked toward Daniel. "You're destroying the foundation over a few administrative mistakes." Daniel answered quietly. "No, we would destroy it by discovering the mistakes and refusing to correct them." The board voted that afternoon. Whitmore was removed as chair of the Scholarship Review Committee. The hardship appeal process was suspended and rewritten. An independent review panel would handle future appeals. Students could receive temporary protection while their appeals were being considered. The foundation would publish clearer standards. Most importantly, the board approved an independent oversight committee with student representation. Marcus Reed's scholarship was restored. His appeal was approved under the revised process. When Annie heard the news, she did not celebrate immediately. She sat quietly in the legal clinic while Renee read the official letter. "Your scholarship has been reinstated," Renee said. Annie closed her eyes. Then she smiled. "What about the other students?" Renee looked at the next page. 23 former recipients are being contacted for review. Annie let out a breath. That's better. It is. Annie folded the letter carefully. I thought I'd feel different. You will. When? When you stop measuring justice by how relieved you feel. Annie looked at her. Renee smiled. You asked a good question. The system answered it. Now you keep going. Later that evening, Daniel found Annie outside the foundation building. She was sitting on a bench with her backpack beside her. You knew I'd be here? No. I'm glad you came anyway. Daniel sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Annie said, You lost a board member. Whitmore resigned, and some donors left. A few. Are you okay? Daniel looked across the street at the evening traffic. I'm learning that being okay and knowing you did the right thing are not always the same. Annie nodded. Did you ever regret standing beside me that day? Daniel turned toward her. Not once. She smiled. I was so scared. I know. I thought everyone was laughing at me. Some probably were. Annie gave him a look. Daniel smiled. But they weren't the people who mattered. She looked down at her hands. Do you remember what I asked you? When you walked up there? She nodded. You asked if I would come with you. Annie smiled. I thought you were just going to stand beside me for one picture. So did I. She laughed. Daniel looked at her. Turns out that was the beginning of a much longer walk. Annie looked toward the foundation entrance. I want to become a lawyer. I know. I want to work with students like Marcus. I know. And I want to help people understand that asking for help isn't weakness. Daniel nodded. Then you know what you're doing. Annie stood and lifted her backpack. Not yet. Not yet? I still have law school applications. Daniel smiled. Then I suppose you'd better get started. Years later, Annie stood in a courtroom in downtown Atlanta, wearing a black suit and a simple gold pin on her lapel. She was no longer the student who had stood behind a curtain holding a scholarship invitation with trembling hands. She was an attorney representing a young woman whose family was facing the loss of their home. Annie placed a file on the table and addressed the judge. My client is not asking for special treatment. She is asking for the rules to be applied fairly. Her voice was steady. After the hearing, she walked outside and called Daniel. You were right. He laughed through the phone. That phrase is becoming a tradition. No, about something else. What? Sometimes you don't change a system by fighting everyone inside it. Daniel waited. You change it by staying long enough to understand where it fails. Daniel smiled. And then you make sure the next person doesn't have to stand there alone. There was a pause. Daniel knew exactly what she meant. He had once thought the most important thing he could give someone was an opportunity. He had learned otherwise. An opportunity mattered. But so did the person standing beside you when you were afraid to take it. Annie ended the call and walked down the courthouse steps. A young woman waited near the entrance, holding a folder against her chest. She looked nervous. Annie recognized the expression immediately. Are you here for me? The woman nodded. I think so. Annie smiled. Then come on. The woman hesitated. Is it okay if I walk with you? Annie looked at her for a moment. Then she extended her arm. Of course. And this time, Annie was the one standing beside someone who was afraid to walk alone. The story reminds us that true kindness is not always about giving someone money or solving their problems. Sometimes, it is simply choosing to stand beside someone when they are afraid to stand alone. Annie's journey shows that poverty, loneliness, and other people's prejudice do not define a person's worth. Daniel learns that an opportunity means little if people do not have the support to reach it, while Annie learns that asking for help is not weakness. Most importantly, the story reminds us that justice requires more than good intentions. It requires the courage to question unfair systems and the willingness to make them better. When we choose to stand beside someone who has been overlooked, we may change far more than one moment. We may help change the life of everyone who comes after them. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.